Welcome into the Rockies Insider. I am your Rockies Insider, Patrick Lyons, on a very special, very emergency podcast as the 3-15 Colorado Rockies make a move. They change their coaching staff ever so slightly with a familiar name coming in. Hensley Meulens, the batting coach, relieved of his duties on Thursday by general manager Bill Schmidt. And in his stead, in his place, is special assistant to the general manager, Clint Hurdle, filling a position that he is very much used to. And, this is a move that I think a lot of people had expected to happen. And then there's a lot of people like myself that didn't think anything was going to happen. And, you could argue, nothing really did happen much with this move, and we'll break it down. Obviously, the Rockies still staying in-house and going with a familiar name, taking from one part of their organization, going to another. Will they replace Hurdle as the special assistant to the GM? Are they losing another set of eyes amongst the entire organization, as Clint's role previously had taken him to all the different affiliates that the Rockies have minor leagues in? So is that something that's going to be replaced? The Rockies also, this past offseason, removed one of their assistant hitting coaches because they cited a reason to get more efficient and that they wanted to be more streamlined. And you can't say that has worked. You can't say that has helped things out with the way things have been going, the increased strikeout rates, the low runs that have been scored throughout this entire season. And yet they're just changing the hitting coach. So I want to talk about, Wednesday night, because it's fascinating to think that the Rockies score 7 runs on the road against the Dodgers in a game that they led 1-0. And then Germán Marquez goes out in a ballpark that he historically has pitched incredibly well in. He has pitched so well at Dodger Stadium. In fact, he pitched so well that when some of the Rockies announcers talked about it, when Germán Marquez got absolutely lit up by the Dodgers and couldn't finish the first inning, was charged with 7 runs, the Rockies announcers were accused with jinxing Germán Marquez. And so that made awful announcing. And 7-1, just like that. It was gone. The sweep was on. And yes, they would eventually lose 8-7. But the Rockies fought back and they got to 7 runs. Their first time doing that on the road since last August against a very good Dodgers bullpen. Now, the Dodgers have not been playing their best baseball as of yet. That being said, it's still one of the best records in all of baseball. They're still one of the best teams on a night in, night out basis, but it does go to show you the difference between a team that is great, but not playing their best baseball, and a team that even when they play great, can't beat a truly great team. That's the difference between the haves and the have-nots, the difference between the Dodgers and the Rockies. So it's interesting to think, what if the Rockies would have won that game last night? What if Brenton Doyle makes something happen in his lone pitch hit appearance, snapping a streak of 5 games in which we hadn't seen him because of the quad issues that he had been having? If they win that game, does this change come about? I don't know. I truly don't. It still doesn't take away the 3 consecutive shutouts in San Diego. It still doesn't take away what still would have been one of the worst starts in franchise history. It still would have tied the Rockies record with a 4-14 start. Like, that's still the worst. And now it goes even beyond that. So the Rockies do the thing that, I got to give them credit, because that was something that, again, sometimes you have to move some things around. And a very common comment online is the Rockies right now are just moving the chairs around on the deck of the Titanic. Maybe not, but they're trying something. So I can kind of give them a little bit of credit for that. In the press release by the Rockies, GM Bill Schmidt said, quote, "This has been an incredibly frustrating and disappointing start to the season, especially offensively. While all of us share responsibility, I felt a change was necessary and that a new voice was needed to give us the best chance to perform as we move forward in the season. Clint's 30-plus years of baseball experience especially over the past 3 seasons, working with our young players throughout the minor leagues, put him and our club in a place to be successful moving forward. Schmidt also adds, I want to thank Hensley for his efforts over the 2+ seasons with the Rockies. He is a lifetime baseball man who still has plenty to give the game of baseball. So trying to make Hensley Meulens look good on his way out, despite the fact that the changes that Dave Maganin made when he first came on as a hitting coach under Bud Black didn't work. More changes need to be made. Hensley Meulens was brought in 2023, and the team struck out more than it ever had. And then in 2024, it struck out more than it ever had. And then in 2025, when they, again, talked about putting bat to ball and doing more damage with pitches in the strike zone, they're striking out at a higher rate than ever before, just under 30%. In talking with some folks in the Denver media, Renee Deckert of Purple Row and Kevin Henry of Just Baseball, we were talking about the Rockies and how well they've been able to actually prevent chasing balls from outside the zone and swinging at only pitches within the zone. And they've actually been doing a much better job at that. Now, yes, 35% of the pitches that they're swinging at are still outside the zone, but they are swinging at 70.7% of pitches in the strike zone. That's 4th best in all of baseball. That being said, they are still 2nd worst in making contact with balls that are in the strike zone. So they're swinging at more strikes than in seasons past, but they're not making as good of contact when compared with every other team in baseball. That's a thing that's going to be a common theme that I mentioned throughout this episode, is the Rockies being on an island unto themselves when they don't need to be. The only island that the Rockies exist on is one in which they play at altitude, and that it makes their home ballpark favorable to them when they're at home, but it makes them disfavorable to them when they're on the road. And everything looks a lot different when you're in that batter's box. And yes, that is a difficult thing to overcome. But everything else that they do should be like the other 30 teams in Major League Baseball. And that's not always the case. So regardless of any improvements the Rockies have made in certain areas, the bottom line is they're 3-15. They are 11.5 games back of first place in the NL West. And since 1995, I didn't post this on the social medias at Patrick D. Lyons, at Patrick D. Lyons MLB. But going back to 1995, with the creation of the 6-division format, going back to 1995, I believe the Dodgers have only finished 11.5 games back of first place 4 times since 1995. 4 times. And the Rockies are already there right now, 3 weeks into the season. They're also 8 games back of the final wildcard spot, which is also in the NL West. But regardless, they're 8 games back in a very short amount of time. They're the only team that doesn't have 4 wins right now at the time of recording on this on Thursday, April 17th. So they're very much on that struggle bus. And, despite some improvements with swinging at balls that are in the strike zone, they're just not doing damage to those things. And their overall contact rate is 69.4%. That's the lowest in Major League Baseball. And now they're going to have a new hitting coach. So maybe some things are going to change. Clint Hurdle, he's a career baseball guy himself. Like, you may not know the story of Clint Hurdle as a human being or as a ball player before he was a coach. He was on the cover of Sports Illustrated as a young man because he was supposed to be this next huge star for the Kansas City Royals. And he had his own trials and tribulations and had a nice big league career, but he had a lot more success, I think, as a coach. He was minor league hitting coordinator for the Rockies from 1994 to 1996. He joined the big league squad as the hitting coach from 1997 to 2002. And once Buddy Bell was sort of done there and he was relieved of his duties in 2002, Clint was given that chance. He was given that opportunity. I believe in one of the stories he tells is that when he received that phone call, he actually thought that he was on the way out. And instead, he was actually getting the promotion. So Clint's got some great stories. And in fact, he just put a book out, which is interesting to think that an active player on a coaching staff and on a team, a player, He's a coach, but still an active player has a book that just came out that they wrote themselves. I know Clayton Kershaw last season had a book that was co-written by Andy McCullough, but I don't think that Clayton Kershaw did a ton of press for. But May 20th, I know that there's tickets being sold for an event in Pittsburgh, a place where Clint Hurdle was the manager for several years, from 2011 to 2019. Won the Manager of the Year award there. Took the Pirates to 3 consecutive postseason appearances. Like something for a franchise that they hadn't been to the postseason about 30 years. So the heyday, there's a lot of people in Pittsburgh that when they think of their favorite Pirates memories that they were alive for, Clint Hurdle was the manager for that just as well as the 2007 run to Rocktober and the 2007 World Series. But Clint Hurdle has an event on May 20th in Pittsburgh to sign his book, Hurdleisms, which is great. I haven't had a chance to pick up a copy myself, full disclosure. I do want to read it, do want to interview him about the book, do want to interview him about coaching the Rockies now. But he's got an event on May 20th in Pittsburgh, and the Rockies are home against the Phillies. What's going to happen there? There's just a lot of interesting optics that, again, I'm not making any judgments on, but some interesting optics going on with that. Maybe the Rockies just have a substitute hitting coach for the day on May 20th, and it's a surprise. Charlie Blackmon's going to suit up. He's going to be the hitting coach for the day while Clint fulfills an obligation that I imagine was on the table when Schmidt and Dick Monfort decide to give him this opportunity as the hitting coach. 2002 to 2009, Clint Hurdle was the manager of the Rockies for a very long time, the longest tenured manager in Rockies history, the most wins in Rockies history before Bud Black came along. So Clint Hurdle's got a great reputation. In fact, even a couple years ago, he almost took a job, I believe, on Bruce Bochy's staff as the hitting coach when Bochy came back to coach of the Texas Rangers. So, look, this is a very well-respected guy, and he should be. He's got great credentials. He's got a ton of success. So sometimes just changing the personnel like that and bringing in someone who is very qualified, like Clint Hurdle is, maybe that does something. Maybe that, puts a fire underneath some of these players, because sometimes you have to be reminded that people's jobs are at stake, and that if you love someone, if you care about them and you want them to keep their job, and you don't want for them to get thrown under the bus, well, you got to do your job. You got to do it that much better. And maybe you do need to feel a little bit of the pressure that some of the Rockies say right now they're not feeling. Maybe they should, because if they don't start playing a little bit better, other people could lose their jobs. And it'll be interesting to see what happens, hearing from Clint on Friday at the ballpark, maybe not, or hearing from Clint Saturday at the ballpark, probably. I know there might not be a lot of people going to the game on Saturday because the Nuggets are playing at the same time as the Rockies. And if Friday's game against the Nationals ends up getting canceled because of inclement weather, we've got snow coming in, they might cancel that so early that by the time media ends up going down to the ballpark, hey, it's canceled, turn back. You're not going to be able to talk to anybody. Oh, you're the one person who did come in. You didn't get the message. Too bad, so sad. You're going to have to wait for tomorrow to talk with Clint. So we'll wait to see what sort of philosophical changes. How is his philosophy different than Hensley Meulens? Is it going to be more of the same, or is it going to be different? And how much is that going to line up with what Bud Black wants Clint Hurdle to do, and what ideas that Clint has that maybe Bud likes and Bud doesn't? And so that's going to be interesting for these two guys to coexist. And I think they're going to be fine. I think they will be able to coexist. This isn't like, hey, the guy that used to have the record versus the guy that does have the record, and it's going to be this clash for supremacy. No, absolutely not. These are two well-seasoned baseball guys. They're great minds. I think them working together in tandem should be successful, and should be certainly more success than what the Rockies are at right now, because I think they're currently on a pace to win like 27 games and lose like 135. That's not going to happen. Even if you kept Hensley Meulens, that wasn't going to happen. But still, you want more growth. Even if the wins don't come right away for the Rockies, you want a lot more growth out of your young players. And you're not getting that right now. You're not getting any production out of Tovar and Doyle. and a lot of that has to do with them being injured. But Tolia, tons of swing and miss. You saw him come through with a pretty big grand slam on Wednesday night after getting the day off on Tuesday. So Buddy pushing the right buttons there and saying, hey, your streak is nice and all, but it's over because you got to make some adjustments in the box there. And he goes out, hits that grand slam. CT Gaming saying in the chat over on YouTube, if you're watching on Twitter, on X, you can leave a message. You can leave a comment over on the YouTube side of things. Even after this, if you're listening to it on the audio-only podcast side of things, leave a comment on the YouTube channel. Now we'll get back to those. The question from CT Gaming, do you think Clint's work with the player development program puts him in a unique role to help guys like Veen, Amador, and Tolia? Absolutely. I think it's one of the reasons why Warren Schaefer was originally added to this coaching staff to be the third base coach and the infield instructor. And you immediately saw the success that Ezequiel Tovar had defensively. Granted, this was a player that there was some speculation that his glove was already big league ready, but working with Schaefer took him to another level because Schaefer was familiar with him in the minors, at least a little bit. And I think the same can be true with Clint working with these young guys and being the prospect whisperer. Perhaps. We'll find out if that's true or not. I certainly wouldn't bank on saying, oh, without a shadow of a doubt, because of the success that so many of these guys have had in the minors. They've struggled with the transition to the majors. Well, Clint was there when they had success, so now he's going to help them with the transition. Again, the high side, if you believe that, is, yeah, it's absolutely going to work, and they're going to start playing like gangbusters going forward. And I think the low end is maybe there's something else much larger at play that isn't really working right now for this organization. Those are the two extremes. The reality is it'll probably be somewhere in the middle, and you'll start to get production out of the Veens. You'll get production out of Jordan Beck maybe eventually in AAA. At Amador, where he's still adjusting, getting himself acclimated to the majors again. Tolia, maybe you start seeing him hitting more home runs. The strikeouts you'll take if you're hitting the home runs. But it's still, again, it remains to be seen what those adjustments will be like and how quickly they'll come to. Because let's not forget, it's not just overnight, Clint's going to totally change everything. Some of the ideas that you have on working with players, it takes time. Here's where I want this player to get. But to get there, we first got to take this baby step. And then we make another step. And then maybe on the road, we take that other step. And it's something that takes a couple months. And if you're a Rockies fan, it's understandable that you don't really have that kind of patience right now because of how poor the play has been over the last now 7 years. This is the 7th season that they are going to be under 500. So it's very hard to have patience and say, what's been the game plan? I'm not really seeing a game plan. You talk a lot about prospects and young players, and it's been a long time coming before you finally given them that opportunity, and here they are playing. And it hasn't really come to fruition. Like, the drum has sort of been beaten that way. Like, yes, no, once these guys get here, we're going to start to see a lot of success, and the turnaround is going to be pretty quick. Give it 2 years. They've been saying 2 years for a couple seasons. Will in the chat, what's going on, buddy? It seems like these prospects had more success hitting the minor leagues. Then they get called up, they regress, and they have difficulty hitting the broadside of the barn. That's something that I don't know if I've said this on the podcast before. I think I have. I try to withhold some of my more critical takes of the Rockies because it can just be a lot to be, negative and, go back and listen to the podcast I was doing in 2020 and 2021, really trying to say, look, the writing is on the wall and that things are not looking good. The Rockies are doing things differently and not a good way. They're doing bad things. They're making a lot of really poor choices, and they're not recognizing these poor choices and making the changes. They're just continuing to do that. And when you make certain large scale decisions, those effects can have, shockwaves for years and years to come. And I think it's still maybe years and years until the Rockies get themselves back on track. But to your question, Will, there's the Rockies pride themselves in being a draft and develop team, mostly because all of the other options of player acquisition, they have sort of ruled out. They don't have to, but they have ruled it out. that despite being a draft and develop team, most of the time that the Rockies have prospects on the top 100 lists, they are players that have just recently been drafted. A couple times, there are international prospects too when they are in low A, maybe when they're in high A, but you're getting draft age players and they immediately go into the top 100. And then over time, they fall off those lists as they advance in the minor leagues and have various levels of success. But statistically, success looks a lot different than behind the scenes. You say, man, these players have these certain holes and they're able to get away with certain things at the AA level, maybe even at the AAA level, but you're not going to be able to mask that when you get to the major league level, and you will get exploited for those holes in your games and for those skills and abilities that you don't have and you did not work on properly, or that you were not coached out of. Those are some of the things that I have worries about. And so Chase Dollander is really the one guy in the last close to a decade at this point, going back to, Brendan Rodgers is really the last one, but Dollander is really the first guy in a while that he's gone through the minors so quickly that everything he's done has been him, has been Chase Dollander excelling and nothing really being thrown his way that hasn't caught. But over time, these prospects that the Rockies draft, which are usually high round picks, they're great because they just came from a really successful program. They were coached up. Their skills and abilities are nice and tuned. But then somewhere in the production line, down in the minor leagues, it loses some of its luster. And then when they get to the majors, that luster is lost even more. And sometimes it does take time. It would be great, though, because there are teams out there in which these players come up and immediately make an impact. Not all players need that time. Not all players need 6 months. They need a year and a half or more to really develop and blossom into the player that everybody knew or everyone believed that they would be. Not every player is like that. Some immediately hit the ground running. And we haven't seen that from a Rockies prospect really since Nolan Arenado. You can make the case for Tovar, I think, as well. Tovar was one of those guys that, I think if you go back and look at his numbers, you're like, oh, he's kind of on par with that. I think that rookie season was really underappreciated. Didn't even get a Rookie of the Year award vote. At that time, there was only three players deep on the Rookie of the Year award ballot. Trevor Story, obviously, in 2016. And he was a guy that wasn't really even a top 100 type prospect. He was a fringy top 100 guy. So that's a problem, I think, for the organization as a whole. And that's something that this coaching change isn't necessarily going to fix. So again, I'm looking forward to seeing, what this change could possibly do, because it is something, and it was frankly more than I thought the Rockies would do. For every person that I talked to and said something has to happen. After that, something has to happen. But people said that in 2022 when you started to see the attendance dip and Chris Bryant hurt and really, not a ton of juice in the ballpark at those games. Something has to change. Nothing changed going into 2023. Then they lost 100 games. Something has to change. Nothing changed. 2024, another 100 loss season. Something has to change. They brought in 2 free agents, Kyle Farmer and Tyro Estrada. They're cutting payroll. That is a big thing that, I'll have to talk about in another podcast, but the Rockies have cut about $75 million in payroll over the last 2 years. And, that kind of corresponds a little bit with the loss of revenue with the AT&T Sportsnet deal. And how much is that really, how much is that impacting their decisions? That being said, you don't need a ton of money to make smart baseball decisions. There are teams out there, the Cleveland Guardians, the Tampa Bay Rays. I mean, there was an article just recently by The Athletic talking about the best front offices in baseball, and half the teams on there aren't ones that are large market clubs. They're just smart. They're just run really, really well. The other interesting thing I do want to point out to come back to about the Rockies being on the island, I recommend everyone to listen If you don't have, like, say, SiriusXM radio, turn on MLB Network. See if you can get what other people's takes are on the Rockies and this move, because you're going to get various takes from folks here in Denver. Yes, something needed to happen. It did happen. You don't want anyone to get fired or lose their job. Now that it's happened, okay, this seems like a good move. But from folks outside of Denver, listen to their takes. Listen to what they have to say about the Rockies and about the Rockies being on their own island, and how that's not a good thing, because the Rockies are on their own island, and that's a little bit how they operate. Again, other than the ballpark and hitting at sea level versus on the road, the Rockies are a Major League Baseball team like all 30 MLB clubs, and yet they operate completely and totally different. And so when you've got somebody who covers a regular old baseball team, it's always fascinating to see what their take is on the Colorado Rockies and on a move like this. Promoting, it's not even promoting. Is Clint Hurdle taking a pay cut? I don't know. Did it go from a special assistant to the general manager, now to the hitting coach? It's just different. It's just an interesting move. Wanted to also mention too, with Wednesday's game, if you got more comments, leave them over on the YouTube side or over on X, and I will glad to answer your questions or kick around your topics or kick around your comments. It was interesting. Mickey Moniak goes back-to-back with Tolia on Wednesday night. And if you looked around Major League Baseball, there were 5 other first overall picks that homered on Wednesday night. It was only the third time ever that 6 first overall picks homered on the same day. Bryce Harper, first overall pick in 2010. One of the more recent ones, Jackson Holliday in 2022. Henry Davis in 2021. Spencer Torkelson, first overall pick in 2020. And then you had Mickey Moniak. So that was pretty neat that you had all of those guys do that. And I think the last time was 2009 when Pat Burrell, Ken Griffey Jr., Josh Hamilton, Joe Mauer, Alex Rodriguez hit homers on August 9th, 2009. And a couple other instances of it too, which was pretty neat. Nick Martini stayed hot. As I said, we got to see Bretton Doyle pinch hit late in the game. We'll see if he's going to be active for this national series, because he had the pinch hit appearance. He appeared in the game. So now his IL stint can't be retroactive to last Friday. His clock is going to reset. But as I've stated before on the Rockies Insider, there's really nobody that they can call upon or that they feel comfortable calling upon down in the minors. It's Jordan Beck and Yanquiel Fernandez on the 40-man roster right now. So they're just going to have to play a man short, which they've pretty much been doing with Chris Bryant on the roster as the team's DH. We got to see Braxton Fulford make his major league debut. That was exciting for him to be a part of a pretty interesting back and forth game where the Rockies really just wouldn't quit. I'll be interested to see how they play against a team like the Nationals this weekend. And frankly, if we get the game in on Friday, because as I talked about this offseason, the Nationals are, they were kind of the template for a rebuild. You go back to 2021 and 2022 when, they were 2 years removed. They were 2 years removed from winning a World Series. And yet the writing was on the wall for them. They had to cut payroll, and they frankly didn't have enough pieces to contend. So they traded away their best pieces. They traded away Max Scherzer and Trey Turner to the Dodgers, and they brought back pretty good haul. Keibert Ruiz is one of those guys. Their starting catcher, a guy that they just extended this offseason. Then the next year, they go out and trade Juan Soto and get a haul of prospects, one of which we might see Friday night, Mackenzie Gore, who had 13 strikeouts against the Phillies on opening day. He's going to be a dude. He's been a dude. So the Nationals, again, won the World Series in 2019, more recently than the Rockies were in the postseason. And yet they broke down their team as best as possible. And they're on the come up now. They're going to be a team that, I didn't pick them for the postseason, but I really thought this was going to be a year where they stepped forward, acquiring Josh Bell, acquiring Nathaniel Lowe in a trade, and overall just rounding out their team and trying to bring in, some more pieces to help them bridge that gap as James Wood tries to establish himself as a star, which he's starting to do this year. Dylan Cruz struggling, but he is a future star, the second overall pick 2 years ago. You've got, a few guys like that. CJ Abrams, who was an all-star last year for the first time. So the Nationals really decided to do their rebuild after the Rockies, and they've done it a lot better. And so it'll be interesting to see how well the Nationals play the Rockies this weekend. Mackenzie Gore against Chase Dollander in the first game. I say first game because is it going to be Friday night? I don't know. Saturday or maybe the second game, we'll have Kyle Freeland versus Brad Lord. And then on Sunday, Antonio Senzatella versus Jake Irvin on Easter. So the Nationals, Rockies need to be careful because they are a team that can steal a base or two. A lot of teams will shut it down a little bit when they're at altitude, where they're not as aggressive on the base paths, but we'll see if that ends up happening. Nats are a little bit fired up right now after that bench clearing incident on Wednesday where Jorge Lopez fired one at McCutcheon's head. Was it intentional? Was it not? Hard to say. Found it interesting. I saw Kyle Wren. That was a blast from the past for me because he was a guy I saw a lot back in 2015, 16, maybe even 2017 when he was in AAA with the Colorado Springs Sky Sox back when they were affiliate for the Brewers. And Kyle Wren saying on X that Lopez kind of did that a lot back when we were together on the Sky Sox. So I thought that was pretty interesting. I do want to touch on the World Baseball Classic because, look, we're less than a year away. We're less than a year away from the World Baseball Classic, and folks are really starting to get geeked up on it. Obviously, the news that Aaron Judge is going to be the captain now, taking over for Mike Trout. You've got Francisco Lindor is going to be back as the team captain for Team Puerto Rico. And 2026, look, it's here. It's going to be quick. We don't know when the next one's going to be because the next CBA has to be signed. So we don't know if it's going to be 2029. Is it going to be 2030? Is it going to be 2031? We won't know until the CBA gets worked out after the end of next season. It's one of the reasons why they want it to be every 4 years, but they haven't been able to do it. I think less than half the time they've had it exactly 4 years. Jeff asking, we making the record for most losses in a season? No, I don't think the Rockies, I don't think they're going to be that bad. I don't think they're going to lose 121 like the White Sox. But, I also know that there's not a ton in reserves right now for this team in terms of support and in veteran guys. And that was something that, look at how rough that 2023 team was. And they had to pick 3 starting pitchers off the scrap heap. Right? Ty Block was in the starting rotation at that point. Well, you had Chris Flexen, Chase Anderson, Jose Urena, just to keep themselves alive. And yet they only lost 103 games. They might have to do that again this year. The problem is you've got so many young players right now on this 40-man roster and so many more knocking on the door that you're going to have to put on the 40-man roster this winter anyway, that you don't even have the luxury to pick up a guy off the scrap heap that another team dropped off their 40-man and designate him for assignment. You don't have that luxury. You've put all your eggs into this basket of these are the young guys and we're going to build around them. And they are special. That's why we didn't trade them. That's why we didn't say this guy's going to be the thing and that guy isn't. We think they might both be the thing. We're not really even sure. We're going to let this thing play itself out. That's how the Rockies have gone about this. And so now at the time in which they're supposed to have all of this young talent in the majors making an impact, it could cost them maybe 110 games. I don't know. I really don't know what's going to happen the rest of the season. That's why I think this coaching change is so interesting because it was something, frankly, I didn't really think was going to happen. Right? Where's the level of, embarrassment, frustration? When do you hit that level and go, something has to change, and it will change now? Because we went 3 years without that kind of change. And so now it has happened. So that opens the door to maybe more things. But until that happens, I don't believe anything else will change. It's kind of like with the trade deadline. They made one deal in 2021. They made no deals in 2022. The only team in baseball that did not make a single trade. at the trade deadline. Then they made 4 deals, swinging about 5 guys back and forth. Did a really nice job in 2023, a little more conservative in 2024, including trading a guy like Nick Mears, who still had several more years of club control. So he wasn't even a free agent to be. And there's tons of other guys that you didn't trade and get something for. So after 2023, did everything really change, or was that more of an exception to the rule? We'll wait and see. I think it might be more of an exception to the rule, but maybe not. And maybe the Rockies won't have to answer that question because they'll just start to play a lot better. They'll start to play as good as at least they thought they would be. I didn't think they were going to be a 107-loss team like some of the projections out there. I thought it would be in the low 100s. I thought it would be 101 again. They'd have an identical record. But we'll see if they continue to hurtle towards infamy. But with the World Baseball Classic, pretty much the same locations as it's been in the tournament's history. No San Diego this year, no Phoenix. It'll be Miami, Houston, San Juan, and Tokyo. USA is going to be in the Houston bracket. Mexico, Brazil, Great Britain, and Italy are also in Team USA's Group B. USA will play March 6th and 7th next year, and then March 9th and 10th when they're at Dakin Park, a.k.a. Minute Maid Field, a.k.a. Enron Field. Should they advance as one of the top 2 teams, March 13th or 14th is when the quarterfinal will be at Lone Depot Park in Miami, and semifinal and final are coming up right after that, starting on March 17th. So it should be fun again as the World Baseball Classic continues to build momentum, and so many young players talk about the World Baseball Classic with more reverence, saying, oh man, I've dreamed about this since I was a kid. And yeah, like it only started when you were a kid. So you didn't even know that it wasn't a thing before. It just was always there. And that was what baseball was hoping with the World Baseball Classic. And it's been successful. It's been very successful for that reason. So it'll be exciting to see, what happens next year. If you have a couple more Rockies guys on that roster. It was Daniel Bard and Kyle Freeland this past World Baseball Classic in 2023. I know prior to that, Matt Holliday was there. Adam Ottavino has been on that roster. Will in the chat saying the worst thing is, regardless of how many games the Rockies lose, they can't do any better than 10th for the 2026 MLB draft. Preach. Yeah, that's something that Noah and I did talk about earlier this week over on the Blake Street Banner and the Rockies Insider. But that's one of the new rules to discourage tanking. And yet, when you're not even trying to be bad and you're bad, this is even more of a punishment. It's one of the reasons why you might not agree with me, but at the time in 2020, especially when Arenado was on his way out, it was one of the reasons why I thought tanking was the best strategy for the Rockies at the time. One of the key pieces for tanking, though, is having the right pieces and the right personnel in place in your front office. You can't just do it. You can't just say, hey, Patrick, you know what? You're in charge of the tank. I don't know that I could do that by myself. I don't know that I could even hire the right people around me to help me in such a undertaking. But you got to have the right people in place for a tank. That's really been the one strategy the Rockies haven't utilized yet. And I'm also fascinated, too, with the idea that can you still effectively tank right now? Can you? Now, the prevailing belief is no, because as Will pointed out, you could be the worst team 3 years in a row, and yet you're only going to be eligible for a lottery pick those first 2 years. After that, you're going to number 10. And even still, you're not guaranteed to win the lottery. But there's another element to tanking, too, that's not just all about draft picks and all about the bonus pool money. It is about acquiring players by trading off your best players and your best assets and being somewhat of a layover for players, going out, targeting players that you say, you know what? We actually can make you a little bit better. And when the trade deadline comes, we're absolutely going to trade you. We're going to dump everybody. I don't know that you can't still tank. You can't tank as well as you could have a decade ago. No doubt about it. There's no way. You can't tank like you could have back when the Astros and the Cubs did it. And the Phillies dipped their toe in a little bit. And the White Sox did it once already didn't work. And there were other attempts. Orioles, they got in before the wire. That's another one of those things where being proactionary rather than reactionary. The Rockies are always reactionary. They're always a year behind. You could have traded Trevor Story and John Gray before the 2021 season, when teams would have gotten them for a year, a full year, not just a rental for the final 2 months. Could have maybe even traded them, halfway in the previous season in 2020. It was the pandemic season. Fine. Trades were still made. But the reason you didn't even trade them in the 2021 season was because you had just traded Nolan Arenado, and that would be a PR nightmare. So again, the Rockies are always reactionary rather than proactionary. They got to be more proactive. And maybe with the relationship that Dick Monfort has with the commissioner's office, knowing that a draft lottery was going to be on the table, that, you know what? Maybe now is the time. Maybe now is the time. We've got a 60-game season, which means we do have a shot at this. Every team did. But maybe we don't go that route. We already have a disgruntled superstar in Nolan Arenado, and we know that this draft lottery is on its way. So you know what? Let's get at this thing while the getting's good, and let's tank immediately right now in 2020, tank 2021, and maybe the Rockies have Paul Skeens. I don't know, but they certainly have the first overall pick for a couple years there. But again, that would be a very aggressive move, but it's also one strategy that the Rockies had not tried at that point. And again, now you can't really do it to the same effect, but it would be a strategy. It would be a plan of attack. And unfortunately right now, it just doesn't seem like the Rockies have a plan of attack going forward, other than crossing their fingers that these young players do become stars, that they do gel, they do play together, as well as that 07 and 09 team played together, where there was a homegrown group of guys. You could say the same about the 2017 and 2018 group. They were a homegrown group of guys. I also think you can say that about a lot of the teams that didn't go to the postseason, that they were a homegrown group of guys with some veterans sprinkled in. So there's really no one recipe that the Rockies have been able to point to and say, this is what is successful more times than not, because they just haven't had a ton of success in general. So we'll see with this coaching change, if that does bring about a little bit more success. I think it has to. It certainly can't continue this way. There's still enough talent that's on this roster that they'll be able to figure it out and get things working in a much better fashion. And that you've got the Nationals coming up, so you can steal 2 games there. Certainly you can take one. The Royals aren't the Royals of last season just yet. They're floating around mid-table for right now. Maybe you can get one on the road there before coming back home and having the 30th anniversary celebration against the Reds, who haven't totally hit the ground running. Then you get Atlanta at home, who's been struggling really bad. You don't believe they're going to continue to play that bad. But still, maybe, just maybe, because of the teams coming up on their calendar, they can build a little bit more momentum. It took them a little while last year before they could finally build momentum. So maybe this is going to be a little bit more of the same. And now this coaching change, Hensley Meulens out, Clint Hurdle in, maybe that expedites that process, and you get the bats going a little bit quicker. But they might have to wait. Might have to wait for Mother Nature. We'll see what happens if we get a game in on Friday, or if there's a doubleheader on Saturday, or maybe a doubleheader on Easter. We'll see what happens. Should be interesting. At Patrick D. Lyons, MLB, and at Rockies_insider. Please make sure you subscribe to this if you're listening on the podcast side. Subscribe to the channel. If you're watching it here on YouTube, or if you're on Twitter, go over to YouTube and subscribe. That helps me out in a big way and allows me to provide tons of free content to y'all. Appreciate everybody in the chat. CT Gaming, Jeff, Will, appreciate the momentum you helped give me throughout this entire 45-minute show. But as I like to say, momentum, it can only be as good as your next show. So, of course, I'll talk to you then.